Who came up with adding dessert names to Android versions? How Nokia lost the entire market in just 1 year, why Android appeared, and how Apple helped Google make Android the dominant system in the market. All about this right now. In 2006, when the mobile world was ruled by Nokia and BlackBerry, information leaked to the press that Google was planning to introduce an affordable smartphone running on its own operating system. Google's potential novelty looked very promising and quite modern. It had a QWERTY keyboard, its own apps, and a unique operating system. The announcement of the novelty was scheduled for summer 2007, when they also planned to first present the new Android operating system to the world, but the announcement never happened. In January 2007, something happened that completely changed the market. Steve Jobs introduced the first iPhone, and although this smartphone didn't sell actively enough to threaten the market leaders, it still caused a revolution. The Android announcement and smartphone from Google had to be postponed, which became perhaps the most correct decision in the search giant's entire history. But to understand the whole story, we need to go back 7 years. Meet Andy Rubin. Andy is a classic tech guy from the valley of the 90s, and he had already managed to work at Microsoft, Apple, and even the German Carl Zeiss. In 1999, Andy founded a startup called Danger, where they developed a smartphone that was unique for its time, the Hiptop. They introduced this smartphone in 2002, and for that time, it was an extremely futuristic novelty. A large circular sliding screen, a full QWERTY keyboard, and a wheel for menu navigation. Externally, the Hiptop looked more like a compact gaming console than a smartphone. Besides the hardware, Andy also developed a unique operating system for the Hiptop that was better suited for smartphones with constant network access. The Hiptop supported separate applications, could be constantly online, and could send messages not only via SMS, but also over the internet. Everything looked very promising. However, Andy was forced to leave the company, and after some time, Microsoft acquired Danger for $500 million. Microsoft wanted Danger to make them a modern smartphone for their new Windows Phone 7 operating system, but as you know, nothing came of it. In 2010, Windows Phone 7 wasn't ready yet, so the smartphone came out on the old Windows Mobile. Well, at the same time, iPhone 4 and Galaxy S were already on the shelves, much more modern and advanced smartphones. You only had to look at the Kin once to understand that it was catastrophically outdated, even at the moment of its release. After leaving Danger, Andy Rubin didn't stay sad for long. He came up with the idea of creating a modern operating system for cameras and household appliances. He assembled a team of 3 engineer developers, Reg Miner, Nick Sears, and Chris White, and in 2003 organized a startup called Android. According to legend, the name Android came from Andy's great love for robots. Once, Rubin even wrote software for a huge robotic arm so it would make him coffee upon receiving an SMS command. For his love of robots, colleagues jokingly nicknamed Andy Android, using the first letters of his name and surname. That's how, according to that very legend, the name Android appeared. A year after creating the startup, Andy realized that investors weren't particularly interested in an operating system for cameras, too narrow and specific a market. Then, remembering his experience at Danger, he reoriented Android into a system for smartphones. Andy promoted to investors the idea of affordable smartphones that would occupy the niche between expensive communicators from Nokia, Microsoft, and BlackBerry, and ordinary button phones. But investors still weren't rushing to invest in the startup. The market was already crowded, and the Android system was also based on the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel is freely distributed open source software, and according to the terms of use, selling products based on it was not allowed. It seemed like a dead end. But Andy Rubin planned to make money not on the operating system itself, but on its adaptation for mobile carriers. In the USA, smartphones and phones were traditionally sold by the carriers themselves, like AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile, and some smartphone models were modified by them, sold as their own branded devices. And of course, they modified the internals, that is, the firmware of the phone itself. The idea seemed quite logical and viable, but investors again weren't impressed. The competition was too high. But it must be said that at that time, Android itself was completely unlike the system we're used to today. The operating system looked like a slightly more advanced system for button phones. Andy's team even created such a phone mock-up with a couple of programs. It's clear why the system didn't impress investors. In 2004, the startup found itself on the verge of bankruptcy and even lost its office. Andy knocked on every door trying to sell his brainchild and even offered Samsung to buy Android. The Koreans just laughed at this system, considering it unpromising. But already in 2009, Samsung smartphones were running on that very Android system. Help came from where they didn't expect it. Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the founders of Google, became interested in Android. Larry Page, who was threatening to create his own smartphone, was impressed by Andy's previous work, the Hiptop smartphone, and wanted to create something similar. But still, Google's main idea wasn't in the smartphone itself, but in scaling the business. They needed a new platform for internet advertising, and a mobile operating system was perfect for this. After several meetings, in July 2005, Google finally decided to acquire the startup Android Inc. for a modest $50 million. This was the most profitable deal in the search engine's entire history. A year later, Google would buy YouTube for $1.6 billion, and in 2011, Motorola was acquired for $12.5 billion. As we all remember, Google would later sell it, keeping only the patents. After the deal, Rubin and his partners joined Google's staff and began actively developing the operating system. Having already colossal financial support and a team of experienced developers, they oriented Android primarily for button phones with full QWERTY keyboards and advanced internet capabilities. And here's the most interesting part: it was precisely the physical QWERTY keyboard that played a big role in Android's success. Remember how you typed text on old button phones? Letters were divided among 9 keys, numbers 1 through 9, and to select the right one, you had to press the same number a certain number of times. For example, to type the letter B, you had to press the number 1 twice, and to type the letter Z, you had to press the number 9 4 times. A bunch of extra movements didn't allow you to quickly type large volumes of text. And at that time, active internet communication on forums, chats, and messengers was already gaining momentum. Therefore, many developers at that time believed that it would be most convenient to make a physical QWERTY keyboard that would allow easy typing of large volumes of text. Companies like Microsoft, BlackBerry, and Google believed that the future was precisely in physical keyboards. No one took touchscreen typing seriously at that time. The reason was very simple. At that time, there was no developed multi-touch system. You couldn't type text quickly with both hands. The touchscreen phones common at that time allowed only one press at a time, while a physical keyboard didn't limit users. Text could be typed faster. And yet, one perfectionist from Palo Alto disagreed with Google and BlackBerry and wanted to change the approach. Steve Jobs bet precisely on multi-touch. A screen with multi-touch technology was capable of processing several presses simultaneously, and this increased text typing speed. But typing was still far from perfect because the small display and small letters without tactile feedback caused many errors and wrong presses. Then Jobs literally locked his programmers in the office and forced them to solve this problem. The solution turned out to be elegant. One of the programmers came up with a word prediction system. Essentially, he adapted the well-known predictive input for QWERTY keyboards. When you typed print, the system predicted that you most likely wanted to write print, and even if you made mistakes in subsequent letters, it typed the word correctly. As a result of long work, Apple was able to create a perfect multi-touch keyboard that allowed typing text quickly and conveniently on the smartphone screen without any additional physical keyboards. And this was a breakthrough. When Jobs presented the first iPhone in January 2007, Google, unlike Nokia and BlackBerry, quickly realized that this was a revolution and that it would significantly change the market. In the shortest time, Apple completely changed the approach to creating smartphones. They proved that it was possible to make a full-featured and convenient virtual keyboard that made it possible to get rid of unnecessary design elements and create a large screen on which it was convenient to play, watch videos, browse social networks, and even read. Compare how smartphones looked in 2007, and you'll understand why the iPhone made such a furor. Unlike competitors, Google correctly assessed the situation. Within several months, they drastically redesigned Android with an eye on iOS. On November 5th, 2007, in partnership with HTC, Samsung, Motorola, carriers Sprint and T-Mobile, chip manufacturers Qualcomm and Texas Instruments, they announced the creation of the Open Handset Alliance and made the Android system an open platform. On the same day, the first public beta version of Android 1.0 was presented for developers. It still didn't have a proper virtual keyboard, the system looked raw, but it already had the potential for large-scale updates. And in just a couple of years, Google would polish Android to an almost modern look. There was also something else very important that helped Android at the very beginning. The iPhone was sold exclusively only through AT&T carrier, and people attracted by this interesting interesting novelty began to massively switch to AT&T. This pushed other US carriers to cooperate with Google, although before this they refused to sell Android phones. Moreover, Jobs pushed through AT&T the idea that all new applications would be supplied by Apple itself through its App Store, which was not accepted at that time. As a rule, carriers themselves installed app stores and took care of new games, applications, and updates themselves. Google used the same tactic and the existing precedent to promote their market and their own applications. Thus, Apple, without wanting to, helped Google change their approach to the system in time, allowed them to remake Android for the emerging trend, and forced other market players to unite around Android to create full-fledged competition. After such a powerful push, people started talking about Android. Geeks liked the idea of an open system and the ability to easily customize it, install cracked applications and games. In 2009, two legendary smartphones were introduced, HTC Magic and Motorola Droid, which became sales hits. Google that same year released 4 major updates at once, among which was Android 1.5 Cupcake, the second major release in which the dessert name prefix appeared. The idea of giving operating system versions dessert names belongs to Ryan Gibson, who worked at the company at that time. As you know, Google made this into a feature and even created a couple of collaborations with confectionery brands. Despite rapid growth in 2009, Android was still a little-known system in the market. It occupied only 6th place, losing to Windows Mobile, Palm, and BlackBerry. But already in 2010, Android overtook them, and by the end of the year, reached 1st place, occupying a 30% share of the smartphone market. An incredible rise of the operating system essentially in just 1 year. The key to such frantic growth was the large number of manufacturers who joined Android. They quickly occupied the niche, being freed after the fall of Nokia and BlackBerry. Nokia became the main driver of Android growth. The Finns, convinced of the unshakability of their positions and the correctness of their course, continued to release phones on the old Symbian system. Although it developed toward the internet, it was an extremely inconvenient system for browsing, viewing content, and most importantly, simple touch control. Android was a much more user-friendly system. It was initially oriented towards touch control, was simpler and more understandable to users, and was designed for close interaction with the internet. As a result, Nokia predictably began to rapidly lose positions, and the vacant space was immediately occupied by Android manufacturers. Another key to success was the appearance of a large number of inexpensive Android smartphones. They certainly didn't work as fast as expensive models, but they allowed you to get a modern system for a relatively small amount. In 2014, Google released the Android 4.4 KitKat update, which was adapted to work with low-powered smartphones with RAM up to 512 megabytes. This further boosted the sales growth of Android smartphones, mainly from China and Korea. On January 27, 2010, an important event occurred that greatly influenced the development of mobile operating systems. Apple introduced the iPad. Steve Jobs personally announced Apple's first tablet and emphasized that the iPad was the perfect device between smartphones and laptops. Essentially, it was a big iPhone, but without the ability to make calls and receive SMS. The iOS operating system was slightly adapted and looked good on the tablet. This event, of course, was reflected in the market. Every manufacturer saw tablets as an opportunity to make money. Just a few months after the iPad announcement, numerous Android tablets poured onto the shelves. The first serious Android tablet was presented in September 2010 at the IFA conference in Berlin. It was the Galaxy Tab from Samsung. The tablet ran on Android 2.2 and immediately exposed all the problems. This operating system was not very well adapted for large screens. Google quickly released a patch in the form of a special update, Android 3.0, with the codename Honeycomb for tablets and large smartphones. In Honeycomb, they adapted the system for large screens, changed the interface, moved the notification shade from the top to the bottom right corner, and really hoped this would help manufacturers release more convenient devices that would attract buyers. In reality, it turned out that fighting the iPad was almost useless. Tablets had a much longer lifespan, and people who bought an iPad once usually replaced it only with another Apple tablet. The iPad today occupies 40% of the tablet market, greatly exceeding the second position held by Samsung with Android tablets. It didn't work out from the very beginning, but this allowed something else to appear. In September 2011, at the same IFA exhibition in Berlin, Samsung presented something completely unusual, a huge 5.3-inch smartphone, the Galaxy Note. It was so big for those times and so broke market expectations that it was nicknamed a phablet, from the combination of the words phone and tablet. Other Android manufacturers quickly quickly picked up this idea, and soon the average size of Android smartphones increased significantly, and this gave a certain advantage. Watching videos or browsing social networks was certainly more convenient on a large screen. Apple was losing in the size race. The company's philosophy still held to the idea of a small and convenient smartphone that could be easily operated with one hand, but the market thought otherwise, and Android began to strengthen. Only 3 years later, Apple would introduce the iPhone 6 Plus, far from the most successful from a technical standpoint, but this wouldn't prevent it from becoming one of the best-selling smartphones in history. There was another reason for Android's success. Google, like Apple, was able to create its own ecosystem. Android wasn't just a platform for smartphones, it was a whole set of services. The account when activating the smartphone was tied to Gmail email, and the user, besides the Android system itself, began using the Gmail email client, Calendar, Google Drive Cloud, and Photo Service. Cloud synchronization of contacts, photos, and accounts became a powerful anchor, and when choosing a new phone, the user preferred to choose exactly that system where everything was already saved, configured, and essentially ready. In 2014, Google was left by the founding father of Android. Andy Rubin left with some scandal, but by that time he had already not worked in the Android division for a year. He was replaced by the much more agreeable Sundar Pichai. Sundar, unlike the closed techie Rubin, was better suited for scaling the business, and under him, Android began to develop not only technically, but also visually. In 2014, the biggest shift in the system's appearance occurred. Google introduced the new material design style, and Android 5.0 Lollipop. The interface became flat with trendy shadows, and a completely new feature appeared: voice search with the phrase, "Okay Google." With its help, you could not only search for something, but also set reminders, alarms, and even make voice notes. And yet, despite annual major updates, Android was a cumbersome system and often couldn't keep up with the iOS. Google later announced their voice assistant and payment system, and lagged significantly behind Apple in terms of updates. The huge number of diverse manufacturers didn't bother with timely release of updates, especially major annual ones. Having bought a smartphone on Android 7 Nougat, you couldn't be sure it would receive an update even to the next version, Android 8. By 2019, Google reached the peak of fragmentation, the spread of different Android versions in the market. Therefore, in the Android 8 update, a new approach was presented: Project Treble. Project Treble divided the system into 3 parts, separating the main framework from manufacturer's firmware, and thus facilitating the installation of important updates. And a year later, Google switched to the tactic of small updates through the App Store. Important innovations and security patches were separated from full major updates and installed bypassing the phone's firmware. In 2018, Android once again had to catch up with iOS. Apple once again made a small revolution by introducing the iPhone X and a new gesture system. In fact, it certainly wasn't new. Nokia proposed a similar control system back in 2011 in its N9 smartphone, but it was precisely Apple that refined the gesture system to perfection and was able to implement it on a mass scale. Gestures turned out to be more intuitive and convenient than the usual on-screen buttons, and all Android manufacturers, from OnePlus to Samsung, began adding gestures to their smartphones independently. Google also had to do something, and they couldn't think of anything better than to cross gestures with buttons. It turned out horribly, and of course such a hybrid system pleased no one, so a year later the company completely switched to full-fledged gestures in the spirit of iOS. In the same 2018, the Android 9 Pie update was released, and this was the last version with a sweet prefix in the name. Already the next year, Android 10 would appear without any prefixes at all. An era had ended. In 2021, Google introduced a new system design, Material U. In Android 12, large quick menu tiles appeared, system color changes based on wallpaper, new animations, and new widgets. It turned out fresh. However, Android 12 couldn't boast of stability, so in Android 13, Google mainly focused precisely on the stability of the system's operation. In 2023, Android 14 was released with improved personalization and security, and in 2024, Android 15 with new AI capabilities and improved performance. And what about Google smartphones? Here you all know without us. In 2010, the Nexus line was announced, and the first smartphone, Nexus 1, was made in partnership with HTC. In the same year, they showed the Nexus S made jointly with Samsung, and this was the main difference from the original idea. Google decided to focus on the operating system, and smartphones under the Nexus brand were made for them by other manufacturers: LG, Huawei, Motorola, Samsung, and HTC. In 2016, the tactics changed, and Google announced an independent independent Pixel line, for the creation of which they bought the mobile division of that same HTC. The Pixel 1 works well even today. It was good in everything except the battery. And its main feature, not counting the clean, fast system, was the camera. Legends about the best camera from Google persist even today, although of course other manufacturers have learned to make their smartphones shoot just as well. By 2025, Google has already released 9 generations of Pixel, including the Pixel 9 series, and continues to compete in the premium segment, focusing on artificial intelligence and computational photography. So what ultimately became the main reason for Android's rapid growth? First, a series of happy coincidences. From Google's purchase of Android Inc. to the iPhone announcement that changed the market in just 1 year. Google, unlike Nokia and BlackBerry, reacted in time to the appearance of iOS and completely changed their approach to the operating system, adapting it for large touchscreens. Second, Google was able to create their own ecosystem. And third, Android, unlike iOS, is installed on a huge number of the most diverse phones from the most diverse brands around the world. And with the arrival of Chinese manufacturers, the price of a normal smartphone that can be used comfortably dropped to $100 to $120. As a result, we have over 3 billion active Android users today.